Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Uber Cordero Show. With me today is my friend and a very good compatriot that I've known for quite a while now, Adan De La Paz. He's the founder of De La Paz Educational Services and has a long career that spans a lot of things, including international education services, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion work in many other spaces, including the College of Idaho. So today, Adan has gracefully accepted to join us in the show to talk about some of the works he's been doing and also to talk about diversity and inclusion in general. Welcome, Adan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm glad to be here with you.
Yes, it's fascinating your story. I know one time we met for a long coffee conversation that left me with a lot to ponder about. And I just wanted us to follow up on that conversation and see how your project and work that you're doing has morphed over time. So let's talk about your educational professional background. How did your experience in Mexico and China shape your approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
That's a great question. I have a model in the work that I do that it is a little bit different because of my international education background. I think that living in other countries in spaces where you experience obviously culture and language, but it's another form of othering in a sense, right? Because being in the US and being somebody who is from a marginalized background, you're in a situation where we talk about it in Spanish where we say no soy de aquí ni de allá, which is I'm not from here, where the US is from, in the sense of my culture, my family's background is not part of dominant culture, but I'm also not from where my ancestors are from either because I grew up in a different space. So when I do go back and I visit people right in those spaces, they say, well, you speak a little bit differently, or you're dressed a little bit differently, or you like things that are a little bit different. And you thought about that at first in a way, or I did, I should say, where I thought, okay, where do I fit in? And when I started doing international work, I really enjoyed the idea of global citizenship because it was a space where everybody had a background that was, in many ways, very common to have a situation like mine, right? It wasn't awkward to have to explain, well, this is this situation and this is why I know this or where I have this, part of my identity or my background. And people were like, oh, that's similar to me. Or I have an example that's not quite the same, but I can connect. And I found that to be very refreshing. And so those experiences have really been have left an impression on me. And when I started doing uh, higher education work in the international education space, I started looking at ways that we could create greater spaces of belonging. Well, it starts really with trust, safety, and then we move to belonging and mattering for our students and for others, right, that are part of our community. And so I started thinking about ways that we could tie in the lessons learned in international education and international just living internationally into a domestic space, which was the inclusion, right, the equity space, because on a lot of levels they can be siloed, right? Some of these are very domestic based issues. These are over here very international or global. And how do we make these like global is what they say, right? They're a combination of what's global and local together. And so I started using different models. One of the ones that I use the most is interculturality, and how we can tie that into scaffolding for DEI, which real quick is just three components, which is promotion of dialogue. We have a high level of polarization. We have weaponization of language and semantics right now, excuse me, when it
Mhm.
comes to this conversation. So promotion of dialogue is key. The second one is respect for inherent dignity, which is looking at our shared humanity, right? How do we have shared humanity and then also mutual purpose, right? Because we're all about, in my mind, community building. We're interconnected, but we're interdependent at the same time. And then the
Mm.
last one is preservation of identity and culture. Identity dimensions, culture are so important in who we are. I know that personally because the way I make meaning of the world is based off of my identity, my culture. The way that I make decisions, who I am, what I do is all right wrapped into that. So when people understand, right, my identity, my culture, when we're working in teams, for example, they're going to better understand why I made a decision, why I said something that I said, so that when conflict does arise, we're going to find healthy and functional ways to navigate that conflict or that those types of difficult challenges or barriers that exist between us.
Yeah, that's a really brilliantly well put answer to the question that I asked. I'm really wowed with your expertise in this matter, particularly with regard to this idea of shared humanity, which I think is really important to center. And what is humanness? What makes a person a human being, and how can people still be human being but not feel like one? I think it's really interesting, especially for people who've been historically marginalized in non-dominant spaces. Now, back to the question. You're in China. You work in higher education in China, right?
Both. I worked in higher education and I worked in international K through 12 schools as well. Both.
Oh, really? And your role there was as a teacher, an English teacher or what?
A combination. So I did work teaching English, but then with higher ed, I also taught. They asked me to teach courses on U.S. Culture and media, and then they also asked me to do work in spaces of teaching how to understand the cultural norms and practices right from the U.S. and from in some regards North America. And then they also asked me to do some advising for international students for pursuing graduate school. And we had a really good group of individuals that were there. Some of them were even Spanish speakers, so I was able to do that in a way that allowed for them to use first language, which they really appreciated. So that was neat. So I had a variety of roles that I had at the institutions that I worked at.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So in your view, what are some unique challenges and opportunities related to DIE work that is very specific to Idaho compared to other spaces? So we're
Yeah.
building up on that local thing that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. So my work does span both the local, the regional, national, and international right levels. So this is a great question because I do think dearly of Idaho as a place that is home in many ways and is a place that deserves to um, provide this idea of trust, safety, belonging, and mattering for all people
Mhm.
that are in the community, especially those that are most vulnerable, those that are most marginalized. And so the conversation of, what does that look like? How does that compare? Is that it's similar in many ways to other places. I mean, there's several states that are going through challenging times right now. I mean, if you look at the news and the media and legislation that's out there, this isn't an Idaho thing where, okay, we need to improve the way that we do inclusion and equity. We need to bring in more diversity. This is something that, there's several places that are working on this or that have needs to improve in this area. So that's the first thing to share. The second thing is that there is a great community of both practitioners, but just diversity in general that exists. If you think historically to the Treasure Valley, right, which is where I know most of my Idaho background to be from, just because of where I lived and spent a lot of time, is that you have one end of the Treasure Valley which spans from the Oregon border going towards the right Boise, which has been known really heavily as an agriculture base. So that's where a lot of our migrant families and my family came to Idaho many years ago, not to downhill ski or to go fly fishing. Those are great activities, but came to do the work that not many are willing to do, right? Which is that farm work, campesino work, that field work. And over time, right, you settle because there's this micro trail that goes from different state to different state and decided, okay, we're going to stay here in Idaho. So that's on one end of the valley, and a lot of those families have settled. So there's a heavy and dense, right, influence of population, but the influence, right, of Latine in that side of the valley, and it's spread to other parts. But for example, if you want to have some of the best, right, Mexican food, right, you're going to want to go to Caldwell or maybe Nampa, right, to get some of that. And then if you
Shout
go to
out to
the
Anamo. They didn't pay us, but we're gonna do that. Yeah.
and then as you start looking towards the other side, let's say for example, I mean, you
Yeah.
could go all the way to Mountain Home, right? And you have an Air Force base and the diversity that's brought in from an Air Force base. But then you also have a refugee resettlement community, right? That's in Boise. And so you see the beauty of the cultures and the individuals that are coming to make Boise. And now with the growing, right, boom of housing and I'd say in some ways gentrification, you're starting to see the need to move out of Boise into Meridian and into Canyon County from Ada County of some of those families that are resettling so that they can go ahead and, make ends meet. So you're starting to see a really, really interesting, diverse demographics take shape in the valley, which in turn means that it's really important that we focus on how do we create that belonging, how do we create that mattering. And then one group also to bring up is there's also corporations. You got to think of like HP and Micron and some of those type of businesses that are constantly wanting to bring in top talent, which is diverse, which is global. And so there are also community members that are from all over the world, right, from all identity dimensions that are also part of the community as well. So there is opportunity, there is great ways to honor and celebrate the diversity that exists in the area.
Yeah, that's interesting, and a general summary of how the demographics in the Treasure Valley is changing, and that does require changing in how we treat people who are different and how we accommodate it. I was interested in what is specific about Idaho that's particularly challenging as regards to DIE. I mean, you mentioned several things that are happening all across the state, but is there something that you would say is very unique to this area? That make your work really more needed than in another space?
I think that we're starting to see that the challenge is in retention of top talent, right? So there is a ability to recruit and bring in diverse talent, but the challenge for Idaho, and it happens in other places, but when we want to talk about Idaho and some of the things I've seen is the retention. So what are you doing as far as an organization and infrastructure to make sure that the individuals feel safe, that there's that trust, that they're taken care of? Otherwise, they're going to say, I need to go somewhere else. And so a lot of effort is put on the front end to bring in top talent, the talent acquisition side, the recruitment side, right? How do we bring in all this talent? How do we go ahead and put all of our efforts and our money and our budget lines towards this? And then there's this, there's a lack of understanding of how much effort it is to retain them. And that comes in different shapes and different forms. I mean, I've seen examples of organizations that say, we're going to bring in employees that, for example, have a urban background, and then they're now in a rural space. And they're like, what about transportation? I'm used to an urban area where I can go ahead and get 3 different modes of public transportation. And right now it's lacking. And they didn't have the foresight to think about, okay, transportation is a need of this individual. I've seen things that have related to beauty and hair care or like barbers. I need a specific barber. I need somebody that can take care of me. And there's not enough options there. And a barber shop for a lot of people is not just a space to get a haircut, but it's a space of refuge and community. And if there's not something there that people can go to that they need as a space for community, they're going to say, I don't know if this is going to work. I thought that this would be here. And then in turn, right, teams that are bringing in, like the talent acquisition teams that are bringing in this diversity, that's a piece that wasn't thought of. And how do we go ahead and take care of them? Companies and groups are shifting. They're pivoting quickly to figure out how to make that happen. But that's a thing that I think is still a challenge for the DEI space of what's the backside of this? What is the retention model, the tools, the resources needed to make sure that people don't just appreciate that you're interested in bringing them, but that you really care to make them feel like this can be home.
Okay, now I'm going to flip that question and say, what is so unique that makes Idaho super attractive as a space for diverse people of diverse backgrounds?
I think the thing that makes it attractive in my mind is for a certain type of individual that says this can be a place where, because it's still growing, because there's still uh, uh, a lot of opportunity to have the growth mindset, right? To say there's not a lack of things, but there's a potential, there's a possibility, not a lack, but a possibility
Mm.
for opportunities. So when I would do a lot of work with students, for example, I would tell them, yeah, we don't have this component, we don't have this program, we don't have this, but we can create it.
Mm.
Are you a leader? Are you somebody interested? Because you can go somewhere else and follow in line in something that's been established. And that's hard to kind of leave your mark because it's already right firmly part of a community somewhere else. But if you come here, you can go ahead and leave your stamp, leave your fingerprints on this at those pioneering stages. But it takes an individual that's really interested in that. Some people are like, I just want to go where it's already there and in place. But other people are like, no, I'd love to create this. I'd love to build this. This is going to be an amazing opportunity to impact community, will help my resume, etc. So I try to have that growth mindset when I work with individuals or when I think about things myself in many ways.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It's an opportunity for us to regrow and create the things that may not exist, and that I've witnessed that myself as I've been navigating this place the last 3 years or so. So I wanted to see how your international background, you leverage your teaching experience to bridge cultural gaps and promote inclusivity. How is this trans? Are you transferring ideas from different spaces that you've engaged in and shaping how you work in De La Paz Foundation?
Yeah, I think it really comes back to the idea of making sure that we're storytelling, and more importantly, story listening. You and I talked ahead of the episode in ways that we can really bring people together and not just work across difference, but lead across difference,
Mm.
because I think that's one of the key skills that is needed. And it doesn't matter if someone stays in one location their whole life or they travel all over the world. The ability to lead across difference is huge. And the way that we start that, right, is oftentimes moving away from this, which is our mind. I get people that will say, how do I wrap my head around this cultural practice or this lived experience? And I often say the idea is not to wrap your head around it, it's just to listen, to center that voice, and then to use your heart to try to find parallels between their lived experience and yours. Try to look for a thread of connection, right, between their experiences, right, their identities and yours. And then using this, which you can't see, which is my gut, right, your intuition, and listening to right those bodily sensations. I'm big on somatics also in this space where our body keeps score and will tell us, right, if we notice that we our jaw clenches or our fists clench, or right we start to get a sensation right in our ears or in our chest, we have to ask ourselves why. When somebody's telling their story, why is that happening? And recognizing that we are going to have biases, right? We're going to have our preferences. And the idea is to just hear people out. I had a great mentor that would say this question is powerful. How willing are you to hear another person's truth?
Mm, mm, mm.
Because that means that we can have multiple truths at the same time. And that's hard for people when they're very firmly entrenched in their beliefs, their values, and maybe even their patterns of behavior. And so when we're willing to kind of step aside and put that aside and say, okay, am I willing for a moment just to consider this perspective, to consider this person's situation so that I can go ahead and move towards shared humanity and mutual purpose so that we can go ahead and work as a team to get to that end goal, right? What's that common ground that we can find? So I've really found that when you bring people from different parts of the world, that if you're going to find success, it really requires that. It really requires that storytelling, that story listening, where you can find those connections. Empathy is huge in this conversation, right? So we're looking for empathy. And I would even venture to say we move towards compassion, right? Because empathy is where you feel with somebody, but compassion is where you're moved by somebody. So you're actually you're compelled to move and take things into action. And so
Mm.
when we see people that are at that compassionate level, they're like, okay, I'm hearing somebody struggle. I'm hearing what they're going through. How do I help? How do I be a part of this? And that's what we want to see happen. We want to see more people engage in community building where we're helping and we're taking care of one another.
As you talk about compassion and empathy and listening, I'm also thinking about guilt. And I'm going to explain this so we understand what we're talking about here. It's that sometimes when diversity conversation emerge in places that have a historical fashion of doing things or culture, and then there's a feeling among people of a dominant group that the inclusion of diversity is diluting the culture and um, therefore creating something that's not it, that is not what it has historically been. And if these dominant narratives that are on the margins, as you said earlier, are centered, then the reaction is one of guilt, and that guilt is upsetting. So there's two losses here. One, a feeling of guilt on the people that are receiving these stories that they don't want to hear, and two, the feeling that the core identity of an institution or culture or a society is being distorted. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that it's going to be important to go back to the semantics, right? Or you just described everything. When somebody's experiencing something, right? Our body, there's sensations that are happening, right?
Yeah.
There are reactions that occur, and to just sit with that for a moment, right, and ask ourselves, why is this coming up? Why am I feeling? I do this too, right? I'm not part of dominant culture, but I ask myself, why am I feeling this way when something occurs? And really being honest with myself to say, okay, is that something I need to work through? I need to work on. So I think that's the first thing is heightened self-awareness. Oh,
Yeah.
self-awareness is so key. So I always talk to groups about that being an important piece. I also do feel that there is a lot of experiences with, let's say, for example, DEI trainings
Mm-hmm.
that people will carry with them if they're not positive ones to future ones, right? Because that's how the brain works, right? We have an experience, we store it in our in our memory bank, and so the next
Mm-hmm.
time we hear or see something similar, we're going to have a certain response, right, internally to that. Um, if you think of the history of these trainings, they were often compliance driven, right? So the idea was not to build community, not to look at how we can go ahead and foster greater spaces of belonging, but how do we avoid lawsuits? How do we make sure that people don't bicker and fight, and that we can try to have some, right, some civility, if you will, a term that also
Yeah.
is loaded that we could talk about for a long time. But the idea is it's a missed opportunity because we could be using that as a space to build community. All my work's rooted in community building. So I always talk to people about the idea of it's about solidarity, right? The issue is we got to find what that common ground is, but we have to recognize that in doing this, we see our similarities, but we also have to recognize our advantages,
Mm.
right? Sometimes we get into that privilege word that is also right, a sort of a loaded term, but we have to recognize what are our advantages over certain groups. When we work in the higher ed space, right, we would bring together students that were domestic students of color, and we bring together international students. And we look at what are our similarities, what are our things that we have that we can celebrate and say, wow, you did this, I do this too, but it's a little bit different, but yet all this sort of stuff. And we would build relationships, we build community, build rapport and trust. We wouldn't stop there. That's where some people will say, well, you're not getting anywhere. Well, once we started to establish that rapport, we pull back a little bit, and then we'd say, what are the challenges though that we face as individual groups? So as an international student, for example, what are you experiencing? Well, I can't work off campus. I have huge restrictions when it comes to access to work, when it comes to what I can do, where I can travel. And a domestic student's like, wow, you're telling me you can't just cross the street and work at Dutch Bros like I can? And they're like, no, I'm not allowed to do that. So you're building that empathy and understanding because the trust is there to listen to the story, and vice versa. Maybe some of our international students have traveled to, a dozen countries. Whereas a domestic student of color over here has said, I've never left this town. I've never left this area. And the advantage is that global perspective, those experiences of being able to travel and see different parts of the world. And then that empathy and understanding to say, wow, I want to go ahead and see how we can go ahead and help this person. How I want to see how I can help this person. Right. So that's on a small scale. So when we're able to get people in spaces and see the bigger picture, right? The idea is not to go in, and I call them the shame, blame, get defensive game type of trainings, right? We don't want, in my opinion, to get people in those spaces to say, you should feel bad about things that have happened historically, and you're to blame for that. I think part of the narrative too that gets confused is this idea when you talk about whiteness or white supremacy, for example, just as one, right? There's different identity dimensions, whether it be related to race, ethnicity, religion, non-religion, whether abilities, like disability, like we could go on. But if we want to talk about just this one specific one, is that I often tell people whiteness doesn't necessarily, it doesn't have a face, right? It's an institution, it's a system. It's so established and ingrained that it's not about you and who you are. It's about, okay, how do we go ahead and work to make sure that we're creating these spaces for all to belong, for all to be included, for all to feel like they matter. And so that's a different approach to it versus trying to use that approach of like, this is why things have been wrong historically, and it's your job to fix it, right? And I'm not saying that that's the exact words, but it can be interpreted that way. And that doesn't land really well with people going, wow, I feel like there's a lot of pressure. I feel like I'm being put on the defensive and I'm being attacked. So that's the way I would explain it, more or less.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily just about race, although race is still one of the biggest indicators of absence or inclusion of diversity. But we talk about ableism, we talk about languages, we're
Yeah.
talking about class notions,
Oh yeah.
immigrant. Yeah. And on that, as we end, you already corrected me first because I call you Mexican American, but I don't think that's how you'd really like to identify based on what you told me earlier. But I was just going to say, let's say Latinx identity um, within a national experience. Being from that background, what advice would you give to others who might be interested in pursuing this career uh,
Yeah.
from any other background? How can you tell them that this is not a career for people from historically marginalized spaces?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the idea of identity. Yeah, I actually identify as Latino,
Yeah.
but you could be Mexican American in my case because that's my ancestry, my roots. You could be
Mm,
Chicano, right? Because
mm,
that's another term. You could be Latine, right? Because now there's a shift from Latinx to Latine because it's more based on the linguistics, like the language based, because there is no X in Spanish. So Latine is a letter and a way to pronounce it so that it's a language inclusive, right?
mm.
So it's interesting when we talk about right origins, we talk about etymology, things of that. There's so much culture and history in that too, so that's fascinating in itself. But I think that to get in the field, it really comes back to your why,
Mm.
right? There's a great speaker, the name's evading me right now, but they talk about why, and they say to determine your why, right, is so key because it will help you inform your what and your how.
Mm.
Sometimes we get people and they want to just start working, and that's the what. And they're going to figure out all the tools and the resources, and that's the how. But if you don't really know your why, like at a deep level, what's that purpose? What's your passion? What's the fulfillment? And as we get older, what's the legacy that's tied behind the work, right? Then it's hard to know if you're going in the direction you're wanting to go. But for me, my why really is rooted in the community building, but I also have two children. And my experiences have not always been the best because I have experienced discrimination. I have experienced othering. And so my goal is to how can I leave the world a better place for them and for their kids and for my grandchildren and so on and so forth. So that's really what drives it. So I would say that when people think about what it is they want to do, no matter what it is, but we can speak specifically to DEI, is to say, do you have that fire? Is there that passion? And are you wanting to do this for the long haul? Because this work, there will be days that you are challenged, right?
Mm.
And this is a journey. We talk about DEI work, we talk about, right, inclusion, equity, belonging, all these terms mattering as a journey, right? It's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy on certain days. And so, are you going to be able to run the marathon, not the sprint? Are you going to be able to challenge and overcome burnout? I also want to say for young people, how you do this work as a single individual, how you do this work as somebody who's younger in your career or maybe as a student will look vastly different as your identity and who you are change, because we're multidimensional beings that are always evolving. So now as a parent, when I was doing this work before being a parent, my priorities shift. And so how I do this and how I show up looks differently. So I would give that as advice, because if you're somebody that's saying, man, I want to do this all the time, I can stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning, I can get this stuff done. I mean, my time table has changed significantly. So consider that too. How can you do this work? It's a journey. It's a marathon. And then what it is, what aspect of it is important to you? Because you had mentioned it, and I'll say it again. There's so much breadth. There's so much depth to this work. It's not as simple as, oh, I know DEI anymore. You can't do that. You really have to know certain areas. So almost in a way specialize. What's your area that you would specialize in? Are you wanting to focus in on intersectionality and how that manifests within the corporate space? Are you wanting to go ahead and work with nonprofits and how you're going to go ahead and work with those from lower socioeconomic status and provide them housing opportunities, things of that nature? So there's a lot to it.
And I think, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all this comment. We could talk all day, and there's just so much you're leaving me to think about. But we gotta end it here, and hopefully we can revisit this conversation and develop that last part, which you just ended. So I just wanted to express gratitude and thank you for spending this hour with us talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you for having me, Uwe. It's my pleasure.
Yes. All right. Bye bye. And thank you. See you next time.